Good evening, everyone. I am Rabbi Rubenstein, the Rabbi here of Congregations Beth, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the second of these three programs: Destination America, Jewish and Muslim Migration, Histories, and Trajectories. I can't help but mention that I was at the Muslim Unity Center just on Sunday as we marked the tragic events in New Zealand, and it was said at that event that what we need more of, or let me say it this way, what we hope for less of is events like that where we have to mark tragedies, and more events like this where we get to come together, talk about our communities, talk about the similarities and even the differences, but in a way where we can engage intellectually and have conversation and each grow. And so I'm glad that this event is here this evening. I want to welcome the Michigan Muslim Community Council and the JCRC, AJC, I should say that fully, Jewish Community Relations Council, American Jewish Committee, of course, I knew that one, okay, Committee, and all of you who are here, and I thank you for being here. Have a good night.
Hello, my name is I am president of the aforementioned Jewish Community Relations Council, AJC. And Rabbi, I mess up the acronym at least twice a week, so no worries. I would also like to thank Congregation Beth. I do need an introduction, and I'm happy to give it tonight. So first, Professor Howard Lupovitch received a PhD in Jewish history from Columbia University. He has taught at Cornell University, Colby College, the University of Western Ontario, and the University of Michigan, where he was also a fellow at the Frankel Institute for Advanced Jewish Studies. I can't read that part in this week without just saying a little go blue. It's been a painful week, completing a history of the Jews of Budapest and writing a history of the Neo-Law movement. Professor Lupovitch is the 2009 winner of the Bernard L. Moss Prize for Achievement in Jewish Culture and Continuity in the Area of Humanities. Saeed Kahn is currently in the Department of History and Senior Lecturer in the Department of Near East and Asian Studies at Wayne State University, Detroit, where he teaches Islamic and Middle East history, Islamic civilizations, and history of Islamic political thought. Mr. Kahn is also a research fellow at Wayne State University's Center for the Study of Citizenship. He is also an adjunct professor in Islamic Studies at the University of Detroit Mercy and at Rochester College, co-teaching a course on Muslim-Christian diversity, with areas of focus including U.S. policy, globalization, Middle East and Islamic studies, as well as genomics and bioethics. Mr. Kahn has been a contributor to several media agencies such as C-SPAN, NPR, Voice of America, and the National Press Club, as well as newspapers and other outlets, and is also a consultant on Islamic and Middle East affairs for the BBC and the CBC. And he consults the U.S. and UK governments on their respective Muslim communities. It is my great pleasure to welcome up Professors Lupovitch and Kahn. Thank you so much.
I guess I'm going to go first. Okay. my great tradition. Exactly. Or, chronology. Well, good evening, Erev Tov, Assalamu Alaikum. Welcome everyone to Congregation Beth. This is not only a nice place to be, I'm also a member here, so welcome to my synagogue. In that room over there, I use a very different part of my brain. I get to read the Torah every week, but that's like I said, that's a different persona, a different part of my brain. So welcome. It's really a pleasure to see everyone tonight. Before I started, I wanted to just say, I wanted to mention the fact that tomorrow night, Jews around the world will be celebrating the holiday of Purim. And it's something we do every year, but I think this year, given the events of last week in New Zealand, it has a kind of special resonance because, for those of you who don't know, the Jewish holiday of Purim really is a moment where Jews faced an existential threat, as described in the book of Esther. The imperial vizier of Persia was going to kill all the Jews. Haman, the evil Haman, was going to kill all the Jews. And this is on one level a story of heroic survival in the face of an existential threat, but There's more to the story than simply survival. The book of Esther is a celebration of Jewish life in the diaspora. It's a celebration of the diaspora, and it's an affirmation by Jews every year that even an existential adversary cannot decide for us as Jews whether or not where we choose to live, whether we want to be part of the diaspora or not. And I think in moments like this, it's helpful. It's affirming to reflect on a story like that. So it just happens to be important tomorrow night. Well, having said that, this evening we're going to talk to you from a Jewish and Muslim perspective about what we call the allures of the melting pot. Really, we're going to talk about the challenges and the opportunities for assimilation, for entering mainstream society that faced Muslim and Jewish immigrants upon their arrival to America. Let me begin by mentioning a letter that was written to the Jewish News, the Detroit Jewish News, I think 2 or 3 years ago. Now, this letter was written as the public debate over Muslim immigration to America was beginning to heat up. We weren't really talking yet about the Muslim ban, but it was beginning to heat up. And in the previous issue of the Jewish News, there had been an article which basically said that Jews, having had a similar immigration experience less than a century ago, which we talked about last time for those of you here, and for those of you who are not, you know, in the 1920s, Jewish immigration was basically halted by the U.S. government for a variety of reasons. And in this particular article in the Jewish News, there was a notion that American Jews should have some kind of empathy for Muslim immigrants and for Muslims facing these problems because we went through the same thing less than a century ago. That was the article. Now, the letter objected to that article, making the argument that, or I should say, trying to make the argument, that Jewish immigration then and Muslim immigration now are fundamentally different for the reason, and here's why I'm mentioning it, for the simple reason that Jews then were eagerly willing to assimilate into American society, and Muslims now are not. Therefore, they're very different, no reason for any kind of empathy. I think you can hear from the tone of my voice that not only do I disagree with that argument is fundamentally, simply in historical terms, not only flawed, but it's just dead wrong. So I use it as a point of departure because I want to take, when we re-examine the whole world, the whole dynamic of assimilation in the age of the melting pot by Jewish immigration to America upon their arrival a century ago or less than a century ago. And I think there are 3 points to begin with. First of all, Jews entering America then were entering during an era in American history known as the melting pot period. There was this powerful expectation not simply to leave one's immigrant baggage behind, but there was a very specific and narrow definition of what an American was, and every single person, every single immigrant entering the United States was expected to conform to that. This notion of the melting pot was a concept that was coined by a Jewish writer whose name was Israel Zangwill. Israel Zangwill was initially a Zionist, and then he eventually broke with the Zionist movement. That's a different story. But he wrote a play called The Melting Pot about a Russian Jew who basically becomes American. And the melting pot was just that. The notion is peoples from all over the world, they basically are melted together, and the differences and the distinctions disappear. Now, the pressure of the melting pot then was far more significant than any kind of melting, and the pressures of the melting pot now, for the simple reason that not long after the concept of the melting pot was coined, the concept was articulated by Israel Zangwill, there was a counter principle articulated by the children of Jewish immigrants up from Germany by someone whose name was Horace Kallen. Now, Horace Kallen isn't someone we talk about that much anymore, but he was really important. The truth of the matter is, he's one of my favorite writers. Among the concepts he defined was pluralism. Kahn said, the idea of the melting pot, not just that it's an unreasonable expectation to ask everyone to leave their cultural, religious, ethnic baggage behind, but he said it's not good for America. And pluralism he described, well, the way he defined pluralism was democracy for groups. He said in addition to each individual having certain rights, groups of individuals, insofar as they share certain values in common, certain practices in common in America, should be allowed to do that. And the tapestry of all these groups is what makes American society remarkable. And in retrospect, Horace Kahn was spot on, because it's the pluralism of America. This is something we hear all the time these days. It's the pluralism of America. It's the tapestry of America, which gives us our rich culture. And this is something that not only did Jewish immigrants coming to America, not only did they experience, but in some ways they exemplify. So I mentioned the melting pot just at the outset as a way of making the next point in terms of this comparison between Jewish immigration then, Muslim immigration now, in terms of assimilation. The fact of the matter is, when we look from a broad perspective at Jewish immigration, or the assimilation of Jewish immigrants to America, assimilation did not happen very quickly. It took several generations. In other words, yes, these Jews came to this open society. These Jews came to a situation where there are all kinds of possibilities and opportunities laid out before them. And yes, many did discard some or much of the cultural baggage. But the real remarkable thing about it, I think, was that, yes, there was this process of transformation, but there was never a wholesale abandonment of Jewish identity. Now, this is something which may seem odd, especially if you have some familiarity with American Jewish history. Because the fact of the matter is, the way American Jewish history has been written, certainly among historians, but I think among a broader readership, there are two competing views of the American Jewish experience, particularly the American Jewish immigrant experience and the assimilation experience. There is a very pessimistic view, which holds that every wave of Jewish immigration that has come to America has eventually dried up through assimilation, and the only reason there are still Jews here is because a subsequent wave arrived to replenish American Jewry, but ultimately that wave is going to dry up too, and the only reason, according to this argument, there are still Jews in America is because that very large wave of Jews from Eastern Europe, several million Jews, hasn't dried up yet. That is a very negative and pessimistic view. It's also very common. The other view, though, the more optimistic understanding of American Jewry is, while there has generally been quantitative decline, yes, there has been disaffection. There have been Jews who have left the Jewish community because of the openness of America. There's always remained a committed, critical mass of American Jews. Every generation of American Jews thought it was going to be the last one. That is a fact. Without exception, for 300 years, thankfully, they've all been wrong. They've all been wrong. And the question is, it forces us to look at this question of Jewish assimilation in America in a more complex and less binary way. So let me attempt to do that a little bit. First, I would say that the way the term assimilation is used is often loaded. There are some who, when they think about Jews assimilating, they have a rather narrow definition of the concept to mean giving up religious observance. So that Jews who no longer keep kosher, or observe the Sabbath, or go to synagogue on a regular basis, or at all, these Jews are assimilated. In other words, non-observance and assimilation are, in the mind of some, seen as congruent and absolutely equal, indistinguishable. I'll give you that. There are some segments of the Orthodox world that look at Reformed Jews and say, they're not Reformed, those Jews are assimilated. They're very different things. Now, what this point of view overlooks, and this is really a central point of what I have to say this evening, what they're overlooking, and it's one of the great successes of American Jewry in the 20th century. And one of the keys to the survival of American Jewry as a people, and American Jewish culture, despite the grand prospects of assimilation. And that is the reinvention, or the invention of new identities. The invention, in particular, the invention of Jewish identities which are secular in nature. Now, secular Jewish identity was fashioned in a number of different contexts. In the Zionist context, there was this early Zionist thinker whose name was Asher Ginsburg, who went by the pen name Ahad Ha'am, who was a secular Jew from Russia, and then a secular Jew in the land of Israel. He had abandoned religion, but he said that didn't mean he didn't have a Jewish identity. And there were Jews who were part of a Jewish socialist movement called Bundism. They were also secular Jews. Now, the question is, these were Jews who had abandoned religion entirely. They believed that religion, the practice of Judaism, was irrelevant, out of date, and yet they lived a full Jewish life. They didn't need religion to do it. Now, how do they do that? First and foremost, and this is one of the keys to the preserving of American Jewish identity in the face of assimilation, it begins with language. What was done was the Hebrew language was reinvented as a modern spoken language, and the Yiddish language was reinvented as a modern spoken language. And around these new modern languages, there emerged these new modern cultures. Now, one of the reasons this resonated so deeply and was so significant is the fact of the matter is, many, perhaps most Jews who came to America, within a generation or two, religion had virtually disappeared from their families. The fact of the matter is, for 100 years, American Jewry has been overwhelmingly religiously lax or indifferent. And yet, despite that, there have still been vibrant American Jewish communities all over the world. Now, that doesn't mean that religion and religious observance didn't play an important part, because even in the religiously observant world of American Jewry, even those Jews who continue to maintain a sense of identity in the traditional religious way, they reinvented religious observance, or they modified it, they transformed it in a way to adapt to America. And by adapting to America, and this was one of the main challenges of American Jews facing the melting pot, facing the openness of American society. So let me be clear what I mean by both of those things. The melting pot said you are expected to become American. American in everything you do. So the first question was, how do you become American on the one hand and still maintain a sense of Jewishness on the other hand? How do you become a loyal, patriotic American, but still have a sense of that being Jewish is something distinct? That's the one problem. The other problem, the other real challenge, what we might call the challenge of religious identity and communal solidarity in the age of religious volunteerism, in a setting of religious volunteerism. Because this is one of the main differences between being Jewish in America and being Jewish in most parts of Europe. In Europe, really, in some parts of Europe, until the 20th century, Jewish communities were not only communities, they had real authority. The leaders of the Jewish communities in many parts of Europe had the authority to require Jews to be religiously observant and require Jews to be affiliated with the Jewish community. And so that ability to, some would say require, some would say coerce, that maintained a certain cohesiveness in Europe. None of that existed in America. The ability of leaders of a religious community to do that kind of enforcing would be a violation of the First Amendment. That's what it means that Judaism in America was voluntary, and affiliating with the Jewish community was voluntary. And so the challenge of religious leadership for Jews in America, and really one of the central challenges of navigating the opportunities and the challenges of the melting pot, was reinventing Judaism in such a way that even though Jews didn't have to observe or have to belong, they would voluntarily choose to observe and choose to belong. The fact that there are still Jews, practicing Jews in America, and by practicing Jews, I don't just mean Orthodox Jews. There are other Jews as well who still do many of these things. I mean, synagogues and temples and schools tomorrow night of all brands will be full of Jews coming to hear the reading of the Book of Esther. That is a tribute to the ability of a generation of immigrant Jews to navigate the pressure of the melting pot. So, well, I'm not saying that Jews did not become assimilated. Yes, one of the things that Jews have always done in America is become American. The American Jewish community was overwhelmingly highly Americanized, but that hasn't meant for a substantial part, a committed critical mass, that has not meant the abandonment of Judaism entirely. Now some of you will say, am I being a little Pollyanna? We see all these dismal statistics about the level of identity and observance of American Jewry. You know, there's this report that came out called the Pew Report. The Pew Report. The Pew Report has given me so much to talk about. Which you know, this was a survey of the identity of American Jews and the practice of American Jews today, and had these dismal results. Outside the world of American Orthodox Judaism, levels of religious observance and affiliation were dismally low. But the one question in that survey, which somehow gets overlooked, but is really a tribute to the staying power of Jewish identity in America, apart from religious identity, is the question that Jews were asked, are you proud to be Jewish? Now, most of the Jews being asked were Jews who didn't do very much that was Jewish, but in answer to the question, are you proud to be Jewish, 94% said yes. Now that is something remarkable. What it shows is that yes, the allures of the melting pot, the prospects of assimilation are very enticing, and make no mistake, for Jews coming from Eastern Europe, or wherever they were coming from, living in a more restrictive and oppressive society, oppressive both by the state and by the leadership of the Jewish community, by the strictures of Judaism, the openness of American society introduced all kinds of new vistas, and Jews explored those vistas. And for some Jews, this means that they walked out of the door. They left the Jewish community in one fashion or another. But it was never wholesale or widespread. Committed critical mass remained. Moreover, beyond that, Jews, even those Jews who immersed themselves in mainstream society, were able to inject into mainstream society things that were distinctly Jewish. Let me give you an example. In the immigrant world of Eastern Europe, and make no mistake, certainly I would say for the first generation, maybe for the first two, that immigrant world was very Jewish. If you visited the Lower East Side all the way until the 1920s or the 1930s, you knew you were in a Jewish neighborhood. The signs, the talk, the food, everything about it just resonated very differently. But part of that immigrant culture was Yiddish theater. Within a generation or so, that Yiddish theater moved uptown and became Broadway. It was Americanized. It's one of those situations where, there's this, let's call it a stereotype, where everyone who writes for Broadway every composer was Jewish. The fact of the matter is that it was really kind of the case. Irving Berlin and George Gershwin and Ira Gershwin and the list goes, Julie Stein and the list goes on. They all had the same pedigree. Their family they were immigrants from Russia to America. They lived on the Lower East Side. They were immersed in Yiddish theater. They escaped the ghetto, so to speak. But when they did, they brought this Jewish culture with them. And they transformed it into something distinctly American, but also with a clear Jewish flavor at the same time. And it was the ability of American Jews to straddle both worlds, to avoid that binary of being an immigrant with a different culture versus being Americanized. The fact that the ability of American Jews to live with one foot in the world of Jewish society and one tribute to their ability to navigate the melting pot. Let me make one last comment. Another important element in the ability of American Jews to navigate the melting pot, and I have to admit a little bit of bias here, and this is in the realm of Jewish education. This was the problem that the immigrant Jewish world faced in terms of immigration. One of the first aspects of American society that opened up to the children of immigrants was public school. Most of the Jews who came from Eastern Europe, very few of them attended a non-Jewish school. They went to a Jewish school which had typically a pretty narrow Jewish curriculum or a limited Jewish curriculum. They came to America, not only were they allowed to go to public school, but the enthusiasm about being in America said the children must go to public school. The goal was graduate high school, go to college maybe, and public school was seen as the way into American society. And not just through high school, beyond for Jews who lived in New York, I would say for Jews who lived here too. Some version of city college was also the path into American society. That was a goal and an aspiration. The problem is for a generation or two, that took place at the expense of Jewish education. There was this experiment called Hebrew school, or after-school Jewish education. And yes, it had some successes, but on the whole, school after school is just not going to work because we're dealing with children, and A, they're too tired, and B, it doesn't come for college. You add that all up, it was on the whole a dismal failure, even though there were some minor success stories. And so there was this education choice between the benefits of public school and a Jewish education. And then an institution was invented called the Jewish Day School, which was a dual curriculum school. And I'm a little biased because I graduated from one. Actually, I graduated from one in this very town, Hillel Day School. But this was not only an experiment in dual curriculum Jewish education, but it was part of the process through which American Jews said, we can have both. We get to have both. We can raise our children with a strong Jewish education. You don't even have to be very religious to do it. You have to be a little, but you don't have to be Orthodox to do it. But we can also give them a first-rate public school, secular education. And so you go through the day school system, and when you get to college, you go to college, but you have a strong enough Jewish background. So the day school movement was one of the pieces of that puzzle that preserved this balance between identity and assimilation for Jews. I would say contrafactually, if the day school movement had not come into being, if the only choices were public school and after school, this would look very, very different. It would look very different. But the day school movement not only helped maintain a committed critical mass, it made sure that generation after generation, now we're talking 3 or 4 generations after that large immigration from Eastern Europe, that there would still be Jews who were knowledgeable, who were engaged, who were enthusiastic, all those things, positive role models, and also have the ability to continue the process. So what started over 100 years ago or so, it's still ongoing in both senses, because the pressures and the pressure of becoming American is still there. It's still there. It is something that the Jewish community faces on a daily basis. And I would end on this point. Let me end with one more point about connecting or comparing this Jewish immigration then and Muslim immigration now. The argument that they're different because Muslims aren't willing to assimilate. First of all, I think that would be belied in some sense by the Muslim experience, and so you can say more about that. But let us not forget, and the American Jews should not forget, that when we look back now, oftentimes we lament how much American Jews have assimilated. We're glad some of it took place, but we wish in retrospect maybe it had been a little drastic. So for American Jews in the 21st century to say, we think Muslims should become fully assimilated, we are asking another community to do that which we ourselves lament about ourselves. So it's all a question of degrees. It's a question of avoiding that binary. It's not an either or. It's not all or nothing. You do some, but you don't do too much. You do enough so that you can live comfortably in both worlds. And this really, it points to the fact that that melting pot idea, it really didn't take here. It really didn't work here. Now look, in the 21st century, there are still people in America who are nostalgically longing for the melting pot. But it's really a thing of the past. The new metaphor, the salad bowl, the salad, the mixture, the oleo. Let's be honest, that's what makes it interesting to live here. If everyone was the same, or becoming the same, that strikes me as a little boring, as a little, one-dimensional. But it's the diversity. And as a community, American Jewry, through its immigrant experience and beyond, has been embracing that tradition of diversity for a century or more. Thank you.
Didn't you mean shul after school?
Well, it's school after school. It's because shul is school. Well, shul is really, it means school, but it really means synagogue. We use the word shul to mean synagogue, even though in Yiddish it means a school.
Okay.
We use it to mean synagogue. I can't explain it any less confusing.
When I was living in Far Rockaway, it was different, but I was 44 years old, so just checking. Speaking of public schools, Erasmus High in Brooklyn, some major musicians. Sadaka, Diamond,
Yeah.
Streisand.
Those are second and third generation immigrants who are very much a part of this. And it's not surprising that someone like Streisand was the one who played Fanny Brice, who was part of that generation of Jews who left Fanny Brice, in front of you, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Okay, fine. Yes. She's the one who basically recreated that. But these are two women who are similar in a lot of ways, but from two different generations. But it had to be Streisand. That's all I got to say now.
Now that we got I saw that movie. Has anyone seen the new Stars Born? Okay, I'll tell you about it, but it might blow the plot. For those of you who have never seen the 54 or the 76 versions. I had my friend contact me, and he said, "You got to watch this movie." I'm like, "What? Really, you?" And he said, "Yeah, man, you got to watch this movie." And I just got back from Malaysia, and so I watched it twice on the plane. I watched everything twice. But anyways, I digress. Shalom Aleichem, Assalamu Alaikum, and peace and blessings be onto all of you. I'd like to just start by expressing my gratitude. I was in Malaysia when New Zealand happened, and I was completely struck by so many friends that are here tonight who I saw thanks to the miracle of social media, attending vigils all week. Gave me a major case of FOMO, fear of missing out, but also notes like my brother sending me an email saying, "Hey, we're together." And it's hard for me not to, this is very rare that I do this, but I'd like to think that we had something to do with the kind of solidarity that has brought our two communities together, whether it is over Pittsburgh, whether it is over New Zealand. The idea that we never stopped talking, and you can take that for however you want, that we never stopped talking. But this idea of people stewing in their own respective corners and placing shibboleths on each other as a prerequisite to engage is something that we hope we never do, that we never ever do, and see the importance of keeping lines of communication and engagement so open. So for those of you, Suzanne and others, thank you. I just wanted to say that. So the idea of giving things up in order to fall into the melting pot. I've been there. I know for many people, they had to leave their Yiddish at the door. I was almost forced to leave my Queen's English at the door, migrating from Britain, but I held firm in order to not fully fall in. I remember, though, moving to Far Rockaway in 1975 from England, along with the ABC after-school specials that while you were going to school after school, I was watching Scott Baio getting stoned.
I actually never went to school after school. That's the beauty of high school education. No school after school.
But I remember on Saturday mornings, Schoolhouse Rock, and there was one that specifically addressed this phenomenon, the Great American Melting Pot. And I remember sitting there as an 8-year-old thinking, okay, this is my catechism to becoming American. There was quite a bit of glory, there was quite a bit of bombast, but it was attainable, it was achievable, even for somebody who was mistaken for being a posh British English-speaking Puerto Rican in Far Rockaway in 1975. I didn't say that everybody in Far Rockaway was smart, and certainly not at PS 197. My best friend's name was Brian Seidman, and he introduced me to this phenomenon called kickball. And I'm like, what the hell is this? You roll a ball and then you kick it, and then you go in a circle. I said, this has nothing to do with cricket. But he helped me out in assimilating. I was also told by my father, who was perhaps one of the greatest nudgers of the melting pot theory, says, you will like baseball. This is your entry into becoming American. I'm like, do you understand? He said, no, you will teach me. But he said, you've got a choice of 2 teams that you can support. And only 2 teams, the New York Mets and the New York Mets. I'm like, you know, Dad, there's actually another team in New York, it's called the Yankees. He says, yeah, you can't support them. I'm like, what do you know about them? He says, they played baseball in the Bronx, and I'm too scared to take you to the Bronx. Because again, 1975. So we'll go to Shea Stadium in Queens, perfectly safe. We live in Queens. There you go. Except what was really fascinating is around that time, you might remember this, Yankee Stadium was being refurbished. And so the Yankees did play all their home games at Shea Stadium. But he says, no, we're still not going to see the Yankees at Shea Stadium because it's still going to be dangerous. I never understood that. But I was a loyal Mets fan, and as a matter of indulging you, if you can say a prayer for Tom Seaver, who was diagnosed with dementia, my first hero when it came to America. Tom Terrific, the franchise, and getting to see him pitch was certainly great. Regarding the melting pot, looking at this first as an academic and having studied people like Israel Zangwill and Horace Callan, and the description of what it means to fall into the melting pot, to lose any of your particularities when it comes to ethnic, cultural, linguistic, or even religious identity and just become American. Wow. I mean, it is an incredible idea because in many ways it is quintessentially American. There is no other country where you can just simply melt in. You will always be seen as an other. Irrespective of your longevity in that country, irrespective of your command of the local language, customs, or cuisine. I will, despite my protestations, never be seen as fully British by the majority of society. I'm not sure I'll be seen as fully Pakistani now because I'm always seen as a sucker by people at the market. They don't realize, for whatever reason, I can't figure it out, that I'm not from there. Must be the accent. Ralph Waldo Emerson, though, came up with the idea not of the melting pot, but the smelting pot. And I thought that this was such a novel way of understanding assimilation models, because for those of you, where's my chemistry majors? Or, okay, if not a major, minors, private first class. There's something in chemistry called a physical change, and there's something called a chemical change. And a physical change would be more like a salad, where you just sort of mix everything inside, and it is therefore called a mixture, and a carrot is still a carrot, and a piece of lettuce is still a piece of lettuce. A chemical change then creates a compound where all of the constituent parts are now indistinguishable from any of the others, and you have something new. And that seems to be really what the melting pot is, and I think Zangwill was quite prescient in using the term melting, because of course melting then creates a chemical change. I think about some of the literature that I read early on, Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, and thinking of Atanas, the Lithuanian working in the slaughterhouse, and how all of these immigrant groups, whether they were in the south side of Chicago or the lower east side of New York, were all aspiring because they truly believed that this was something attainable. This was a land of opportunity after all. But at the same time, what it seems was implicit within this process was the fact that the melting pot still insisted on immigrants becoming white. Whiteness was a social construct within the idea of the melting pot. Now, when it came to Poles, Jews, Italians, Irish, really what we're talking about is latter 19th and early 20th century migration, each of these groups went through a certain degree of what the late Muslim scholar Suleiman Yang called lactification. That doesn't mean, of course, going into a milk bath and coming out somewhat paler, but the idea of going through a chemical change of whiteness. The very famous book, How the Irish Became White, by Noel Ignatieff, is one that will probably evoke triggers for many in this room, and including some, I think, Muslims, to this idea of the process of people who were at one time seen as black. And can you imagine today people like Sean Hannity and Bill O'Reilly ever thinking of themselves as black? That was, by the way, a rhetorical question, so, you know, mind blown. There was, of course, also the phenomenon that some groups had to go through a different process also of ghettoization. Part of that was security, and part of that, of course, was an exclusionary conceit by majority society. So whether it was Pole Town and Hamtramck here creating an enclave, or, as Howie mentioned, the Lower East Side, you had this idea of, at the same time, creating a critical mass, but yet at the same time also an aspiration to move further out, maybe to a suburb, to become lactified, to become assimilated, and to be part of the melting pot. Now, that wasn't something that was available to every single immigrant group. Case in point, Chinatowns. Here you have an example of a demographic group that really was not going to be welcomed in a suburb, unless, of course, they just simply opened a store or restaurant or a dry cleaning establishment and still then reverted back to living in Chinatown. And I just gave an interview on WDET, a very, very nice Bangladeshi lady who wanted to discuss the movement of the Bangladeshi community into Warren and Macomb County. And I said, well, essentially, they're taking the same trajectory that the Polish community did out of Hamtramck. The idea that upward mobility, and of course moving further north into Macomb, Warren, Sterling Heights, seems to again be part of an American narrative that more than one immigrant group takes and borrows from the previous one. The Chinese, interestingly enough, fell into a paradox. They were blamed for their purported unwillingness to assimilate, but were perhaps also impugned for what was seen as their inability to assimilate due to the color bar. I think it's important to recognize that the Chinese perhaps represent one of the first immigrant groups that was restricted because of the fact that lactification was not really an option for them compared to European immigrant groups. There was also other efforts that were made in order to militate against the complete blending of people in the melting pot. Miscegenation laws, of course, are testament to this, because hybridity of race was considered anathema to the American identity. Now, the issue of whiteness as the key starter in the melting pot was a major issue, of course, for Black Americans. Despite whiteness being such a critical litmus test of the melting pot, Black Americans were not the typical immigrant group as when we think of immigration to the United States. First of all, they're one of the first groups to come, and of course they were brought here involuntarily. So it's an interesting dilemma that I would say that when we're looking at the melting pot, where do we place the African American community within that? They were American because of the history of slavery. And because their migration didn't occur through the conventional channels, it wasn't Ellis Island. And it seems as though that is such a compelling trope when we think of the immigrant narrative in America. So much so that it's to the exclusion of two other very significant ports of entry, one from the west and the other, of course, from the southern border. It would be a far stretch at the same time to consider the fact that Black Americans really were allowed to be seen as fully integrated Americans, because during that same period that so many European immigrants were in their earnest effort to go through the melting pot model, they were addled by Jim Crow laws, discrimination, and segregation, not to mention, of course, ghettoization as well. But Black Americans then create very much a parallel to the Jewish experience through the importance of cultural production as a conduit to assimilation, to integration, and I think a word that also needs to be used within the American context, indigenization. And coming from Malaysia, what's really fascinating is here you have three different ethno-cultural religious groups. You have the Malay, who are predominantly Muslim, you have the Chinese, who are predominantly Buddhist or Christian, and then you have South Indians, who are predominantly Hindu. And because all three of these groups were present at the time of Malaysian independence in the 1950s from being a British colony, they all can claim a stake within the Malaysian national identity. And as a result of it, all three are considered indigenized Malaysians. And I think that's a very important concept to understand, and we can talk about this perhaps next week at Wayne State. America in many ways is unique in the fact that it allows for multiple reset buttons. Communities that at one time were not considered indigenized can become indigenized when a button is reset. Of course, that's the good news. The bad news is the reset button is usually the product of something quite turbulent occurring before it, like a war. So the fact that the mechanism is in place gives rather mixed blessings for the ability to then go ahead and invoke it. When it comes to the Black American experience and cultural production, well, let me go ahead and ask the question. What would you regard as quintessentially American culture, other than baseball? Jazz, absolutely, jazz and blues. So when we find that these two very important cultural tropes through music come about, we find that, of course, Black Americans are responsible for this cultural contribution to not only America, but I would also say, yes, but that's his topic, not mine. I stay in my lane, Suzanne. So. And interestingly enough, not only Black American and Jewish contribution, but now here I'm going to make the distinction. Black American contribution was also in many ways Muslim contribution, because many of the early jazz and blues founders were in fact Muslim. Many converted from Ahmadiyya Islam. As we talked about 2 weeks ago at the Muslim Unity Center, blues was a product of ex-slaves moving earth all day in the post-Civil War America. And there's a song called Levee Camp Holler. Anyone familiar with this? This is completely different from Led Zeppelin's When the Levee Breaks, I promise you. But Levee Camp Holler has the cadence, has the melody of the Muslim call to prayer. And so we find then that there was something quite primal that remained within the consciousness and through the generations of the slave experience to then re-express itself in a new musical form, which was the blues. Similarly, instruments that were part of Muslim culture in Africa make their way to the United States and then become absorbed within first blues and then also jazz. Drums, for example, are a quintessential part of Muslim music. And yes, Muslims do have music, and many will profess, even the most fundamental, that the only permissible instrument would be the drum, because it is not a stringed instrument, is not something that can create a kind of Orphean hypnosis or mesmerization. fascinating, though, that slave owners banned slaves from using drums. Reason? Signaling, yes. Drums were feared to be a form of communication. And so this was then deprived of them. But when the opportunity lends itself, we find that Black Americans then use drums really as a rebuke to the slave past. Banjos, which were constructed by the Black American community, harkens back to stringed instruments like the guitar coming from the oud, the Arab instrument. Now, slave owners didn't seem to have a problem with stringed instruments because it reminded them of the European violin. And, I mean, who wants to send smoke signals using a stringed instrument anyway? The fiddle, which is seen as such an iconic musical instrument, again, within early Black music, has, of course, its origins with the oud. I saw a really good documentary about how Charlie Daniels started off as being a guitarist, and then he realized that a fiddle was basically a guitarist played up on your chin. I said, wow, never saw that one. But, you know, the devil did go down to Georgia. Jazz music, John Coltrane and his iconic A Love Supreme, but within that, the refrain is also Allah Supreme. So it's interesting to see how Islam infuses such a watershed moment within jazz. Black American Muslims in jazz, we have pianists like Ahmed Jawal, McCoy Tyner, also known as Suleiman Saad, saxophone players Yusuf Latif and Sahib Shihab, drummers including Art Blakely, and have any of you heard of any jazz? Okay, awesome. Omar Hakim, one of my favorites, played for the Weather Report, played on David Bowie's Let's Dance, also played on Sting's Bring On the Night, and The Dream of the Blue Turtles. Kenny Dorham, the composer. Okay, here's a personal story. So in January, I'm flying to London, and there's somebody at the gate, and a bunch of music roadies, and they're talking to somebody, and they're saying, yeah, we're going to be touring Europe, and then we're going to Australia. And big, heavy-set African-American guy. And so I asked him, I said, oh, you guys are going on tour? He says, yeah. I said, with a band? And he said, yeah. And I said, the MC5? And he started laughing. I said, no. It was the Four Tops. And what the only surviving member of the Four Tops, because Levi Stubbs was a memory, is Abdul Duke Fakir, Ethiopian and Bangladeshi heritage. So we find even within the Motown realm, the cultural production of Black Muslims is there. Now many took Arabic names, but of course for expediency and to maintain space within the public sphere, they maintained their Christian names. And of course, to parallel the Jewish experience, I went through the Rolodex to see who was who. So Emmanuel Goldenberg? Anyone? Hollywood? No. That was Irving Berlin. Edward G. Robinson. Okay. I know I've given you this one, so this should be a freebie. Isur Danielovich. Kirk Douglas. Betty Joan Persky. Right. Okay. So, all right. That's all I got for you. But that was pretty good. Now, after World War II, the melting pot became a little more, I should qualify this, culturally inclusive, in part thanks to military service. While during the war you had segregated divisions, of course the Tuskegee Airmen for African Americans, the 442nd Infantry for Japanese Americans, the reset button for a bit more indigenization happens after the war. Now prior to World War II, when it came to Muslim immigrants to the United States, they tried to follow the melting pot model because that was the dominant sociological model of assimilation. But it came at a price. And we see this happening mostly with Levantine Muslims, those who were migrating from Syria, Lebanon, Arabs. Of course, all Arabs who migrated during that time were not Muslim, many were Christian. But you find going through a similar linguistic or etymological metamorphosis when it came to names. You see a very high prevalence of that generation who are going from Mohammed to Mo or to Mike. In fact, a gentleman by the name of Muhammad Abdul Noor, may be known to some of you who are sporting fans, especially basketball. I don't think he ever dribbled a ball, but he was instrumental to the Detroit Pistons. Muhammad Abdul Noor is Mike Abdenauer, the trainer for the Detroit Pistons. Ali becomes Al, Jafar becomes Jeff, Khalil becomes Carl, Bilal becomes Bill. This seemed to be, again, that price to pay in order to melt in. Names going through a chemical change. For many other Muslims, though, the melting pot was a difficult option, if available at all, even in the 1960s and 70s because of the color line. And so when we find the relaxation of immigration quotas after the enactment of the Civil Rights Act in 1965, the relaxation of quotas then allows for more Muslims to come from the Middle East, from South and Southeast Asia, as well as Africa. There's a Harvard scholar, himself actually Zoroastrian by background, by the name of Homi Bhabha, and he talks about in his very excellent book, The Location of Culture, the concept of the visible minority. That you can, and I will go ahead and invoke the Rolling Stones here, you can try, and you can try, and you can try, and try, but you can't get no assimilation. That's not quite what Mick sang, but okay, I'm still working for you, Brian, on a Beatles reference. I've got one actually for you, we'll talk later. With major immigration reform in the mid-1960s, you find that the vast majority of Muslim migrants nonetheless at least try to strive for following the melting pot. It was a dream, it was part of the imagination even before they came to this country. It is as if they were being told, go west, young man and young woman, and melt in, and you shall receive the promised land. Part of this was facilitated because when this migration wave happened, Islam was not the primary identity marker for these individuals. It was in fact subsumed into their ethno-cultural national origin identity. So people were coming to the United States not necessarily as Muslim, they were coming in as Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, Egyptians, etc. Oh, thanks so much. In a way, that perhaps made the process of assimilation easier, because Muslims did not feel as though they were having to abdicate or renounce their religious identity. If it meant that they had to become a little bit squishy when it came to their cultural identity, so be it. It's perhaps a little bit negotiable, unless you're my mom. But by and large, we find then that this facilitated assimilation. Now, at the same time, Islam in the 1960s in the United States already was being perceived as having a domestic identity. And this, of course, was the Nation of Islam. Which brings us to a fascinating evolution when it comes to the public face of Islam in America. During the 1960s, the two most recognizable Muslims were Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali, formerly Cassius Clay. It's also fascinating to regard that Muhammad Ali had a global reach. He was black, he was Muslim, which were rejoinders to that essentialized white Anglo-Saxon Protestant identity. He really was the face of America. And America seemed to, with the exception of Floyd Patterson, not mind that he was that. Remember, it was Floyd Patterson who kept calling him Cassius Clay, and every time that Muhammad Ali hit him, he said, "What's my name?" Until, I guess, he passed out. Even 1972 and the Munich attacks did not make Islam in America a foreign phenomenon. There was a distinction between what was happening over there and by whom, and those who were seen as American Muslims. In fact, even in a more secular confirmation, we didn't see that the Arabs who were behind the Munich attacks were then being linked to Arabs here in the United States. But everything changes in 1979, thanks to the Iranian Revolution. If this was a Michael Jackson video where people morph in their faces, you're going from Malcolm X to Muhammad Ali. The new public face of Islam in America is not Ali, it is the Ayatollah. And this changes the entire landscape, because the Ayatollah never smiled, he was seen as foreign, he was seen as a foe, and similarly then, Islam is seen in that context. And as a result of that, along with a significant fundamentalization of Islam emanating from both Iran and Saudi Arabia, we find that inevitably Muslim life and perceptions by Muslims here in the United States changes. And this then affects the very idea of melting pot theory. Now, at the same time, one can't lay all of the blame on the shifts that are happening outside the United States. America, as Howie described, is now transforming itself from one assimilation model to the other. Nathan Glazer, the Harvard sociologist, and Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who went on to become a senator from New York, had both in the 1960s tackled this issue and were some of the first to then put into paper the concept of the salad bowl, the concept of multiculturalism being not a chemical change, but in fact being a physical change. Well, in many ways, Muslims today find themselves straddling these two assimilation models. Are they part of a melting pot? Are they part of a salad bowl? And this is contingent really on two factors. One is longevity in this country. Older generations of Muslims will still see themselves through the lens of melting pot, while those who are perhaps their kids will now assert a more hybridized salad bowl identity, as well as those who are still migrating to the United States, because for them, the melting pot really is not an option available when it comes to assimilation. Now it's my turn to go ahead and cite Pew. In 2017, the Pew study took a look at Muslim perceptions in America. 98% of Muslims living in the United States agree with the statement, "I'm proud to be an American." I suspect that only 3% said that they liked the song by Lee Greenwood of the same name. 60% of those surveyed said that they have a lot in common with other Americans. 28% say that they have some in common. 36% of Muslim Americans polled said that they have either all or mostly Muslim friends, which means that 64%, or almost 2/3, have a fairly diverse group of friends and social circles in which they operate. Perhaps a more interesting question is to ask both Jews as well as Muslims by Pew, is how do they feel about the American civil religion? And how much do they really interact with that? Because I would imagine that in that sense, even though for many more observant, it would seem as being blasphemous to use the word religion when it comes to American civil society. But religion, it really is. Super Bowl Sunday, for example. And I would suspect that for the next month with March Madness, that's coming a close second. And I apologize that we're up here while there's two wild card games going on. They don't mean anything because Michigan and Michigan State are already vested as number 2 seeds, respectively. But if there is an impediment for American Muslims to assimilate, irrespective of the model, melting pot or salad bowl, I would say that it's not really a function of American culture. In fact, if anything, it seems as though American Muslims are wholehearted, earnest, and ravenous consumers of it. Perhaps the impediment really is about marriage. That seems to be the third rail. If you speak to still many parents, the idea of going American is marrying un-American. Again, a really strange dichotomy to make, that here you have 98% of Muslims in America saying that they themselves identify as being American, but when we're talking about American, they fall back into that trap and trope of whiteness or something that's outside the purview of what is considered to be ethnically Muslim. It's like that great scene in Witness, where Harrison Ford is hanging out with the Amish, and the Amish refer to Americans as the English. Boy, if they could ever meet me, I wonder what they would do. But you find that that dichotomy still persists along the lines of how ethnicity and culture really then inform the Muslim imperative to assimilate or not. I remember growing up that this was a dichotomy. You can marry anyone you want as long as they're not American. And I'm like, I don't even know what that means. Maybe it's code. but at least culturally, it was seen as sinful as eating pork is theologically. So now we find, again, as generations go by, that is becoming less and less of a barrier between these communities. Now, whether that is then seen as indicative of assimilation, I think is still an open question. It seems like a rather arbitrary marker for assimilation. But we find that when it comes to how Muslims see themselves as integrated, even indigenized as Americans, there is the issue, as we talked about 2 weeks ago, the corporatization of Islam. The fact that any institution or organization that is established within America has to run the gauntlet of first becoming a corporation before it takes on a theological identity. And perhaps, again, in our consumerist society, being seen as a corporate entity is perhaps then the paragon of being assimilated. What militates against this, and again I see this within my own household, is satellite television. The greatest impediment and obstacle for somebody to feel as though he or she is American is if they spend all day, mom and dad, watching Pakistani and Indian television. It creates then this bubble and a disincentive to go ahead and assimilate. And we see this perhaps more pronounced in Europe. Over there, there's several more barriers to being seen or being welcomed as a member of those societies. And so we find many ethnic groups will even get their weather report from an ethnic satellite TV station that is being bounced from 3 different countries before it reaches them. So when it comes then to, and I would then open this up also to see how Jews and Muslims go forward when it comes to assimilation, I think it's probably less about whether Muslims or Jews can become American or want to stay American. Those options are generally, at least from a self-identity perspective, fully open. I don't think that those are challenged. Maybe there are few members of each respective community that try to push back against that. But by and large, Muslims and Jews are confronted with the same challenge. The fact that, to borrow from Charlie Brown, the goalposts or the football keeps getting shifted as to what it means to be American. And particularly as we find within the current climate, there is a new configuration and a new terminology as to what it means to be American. In many ways, America is becoming European in its self-identity. And as a result of it, you see the same challenges facing Muslims and Jews, whether they belong. After all, when we take a look at Pew, it seems as though within the respective communities, that's a train that's already left the station. Thank you.
Yeah, we're going to turn to some questions. Now, before we turn to the questions, I forgot to announce something. I was asked to announce that it's really nothing to do with tonight exactly, but if you're interested, there is an adult learning program that's going to take place at the Jewish Community Center on March 31st called Be Mood. And if you don't know about it, you should find out about it. I'm teaching a class. I'm teaching a session on anti-Semitism at this session. So if you're interested, it's not going to be broadly about anti-Semitism. It's going to be about 2 things. It's going to be about the difference between anti-Semitism on the left and anti-Semitism on the right. Secondly, it's going to ask the question, is it possible to be critical of the state of Israel without being anti-Semitic? And I'm going to tackle both of those tiny little questions in less than an hour. So you want to see that that's possible, come to Limud on March 31st. Now we can turn to some questions. There are cards going around. If you want to ask a question, we've got our collectors. And I have one already. Hold on. The question is there a difference between, this is a comparative question about Jewish and Muslim immigration, is there a question between the Jewish and Muslim immigration experiences in terms of the fact that the majority of the Jews came from Eastern Europe and Muslims came from many different countries of origin? How did that impact the immigration experience in each community? For example, in Dearborn, it has Yemenis and Lebanese and other places. A very interesting question. First, let me just clarify a little bit that we use the term Eastern Europe when we're talking about Jewish immigration. But Eastern Europe was not one undistinguished monolithic place. Jews who came from Eastern Europe came from Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, Ukraine, Russia, Romania, Hungary, and Galicia. Now these, in some instances, they were part of the same multinational empire, but they are coming from different places. So I would just say that to make the notion that Jews all came from one place and Muslims did not, it's, first of all, there are different countries, but secondly, Eastern Europe extends all the way from the Baltics all the way down to the Balkans. It's a large and diverse area. And even in our community here, the diversity there is evidence of the fact that oftentimes when Jews came to America, they would form a synagogue congregation based on where they were from. So in the Detroit Jewish community, at the beginning of the 20th century, there was the Hungarian shul, often known as the Hunky shul. There was the Polish shul, there was the Galician shul, there was the Litvak or Lithuanian shul. So I think what you raise here is another axis in which we do have parallel experiences where in the same way that Muslims were coming from different places, Jews are also coming from different places. And even on the basic level of language, most of these immigrants are speaking Yiddish, but Lithuanian Yiddish and Galicianer Yiddish are very different things. And these Jews also saw each other as different in certain ways. There was definitely a pecking order. There were some Jews from Eastern Europe who looked down their nose at other Jews from Eastern Europe. I'd say the Jews from Galicia were probably at the bottom of that little scale, but that's another story.
Yeah, I think that this idea of how mosques organize themselves, it was primarily by ethnicity. There is no first reformed mosque of Dearborn, and, but it's actually happening de facto. If you were to ask Muslims which are the more fundy mosques and which are the more fire and brimstone, why bother waking up tomorrow morning because you're all doomed. What I call the Calvinist mosques. Those everyone knows where they are, sort of de facto. I think we don't even need an app for it. People know intuitively. But you do have, primarily because of language and because of socialization, the fact that mosques served as an epicenter not only for religious life but for cultural life. And now we find that there is a transformation of the public sphere when it comes to Muslims, and part of it is also by generation. People don't feel the incentive to go to the mosque anymore to congregate. They've moved into the suburbs, they have bigger homes, or they have bigger families, and so as a result of that, their socialization has changed dramatically. But I would say perhaps more importantly than just focusing on the where immigration occurs from, we also need to look at when. Because a Syrian migrating to America in I can't say 2019 because they're not allowed, but let's say 2016, back when they were, is going to be dramatically different than a Syrian who migrated to America in, say, 1926. The push and pull factors are dramatically different. The assimilation model in which they are entering is dramatically different. The instability, the volatility of what is going on in quote-unquote home countries is going to have a major impact not only on their perceptions of America, but also on what they feel are the impetuses and mechanics of assimilation. So, okay. Okay, so I'll turbo through these.
Here's a question I think we can both address. How have cross-cultural marriages, by which I assume you mean intermarriages or marriages between different groups, how have they affected the assimilation melting pot model? Yes, intermarriage with the Jewish community it's an important part of the story, and in the last probably half a century it's become more of a chronic problem. And it's a serious problem in terms of preservation of communal integrity. I would first of all say that intermarriage, or for Jews marrying outside the faith, this is part of that disaffection. This is an example of radical assimilation, although what's become more prevalent in the last couple of decades is the phenomenon where Jews marry outside the faith and the family still remains within the Jewish community. A recent trend in some synagogue congregations is, well, not necessarily to encourage this, encourage marriage, marrying outside the faith, but once it does take place, to embrace both spouses and hopefully keep the family within. I would also say that the surge of intermarriage in the United States, certainly for Jews, it's often attributed to the openness of American society. That's a big part of it. Another element is that in Europe, prior to the 20th century, there was no such thing as civil marriage. So in Europe, for the most part, if you were Jewish and you wanted to marry outside the faith, you had to convert as well. Conversion was, the decision to leave the faith was a much more severe decision than to marry outside the faith, because you can marry outside the faith and still be Jewish. But it's really only in the age of civil marriage that is facilitated, but there's no question that in the presence of civil marriage and the ease with which it is to marry outside the faith, that this is a challenge that the Jewish community faces, with different responses. It's an important part of the lament.
Well, some would argue that there's no such thing as a civil marriage anywhere in the world, but yes. Is this still being recorded? Okay, security. There's a fantastic contradiction when it comes to Muslims and this whole notion of intermarriage. The dirty little secret is that there's been a lot of intermarriage in the U.S., and it was for perhaps the real grail. I know, wrong reference here. It was about the green card. And so we find then some very interesting intermarriage link-ups happening, particularly between Black Americans and Bangladeshis. You see this happening and producing someone like, say, a Hanson Clark in the Metro Detroit area. It was a matter of opportunity, it was about convenience, it was also about socioeconomics, and perhaps mixed within that a certain kind of pragmatism. Here you find that the opportunity allows itself to, at the one hand, have transactional benefit, but marriages that still then lasted, endured, and have now gone on into future generations. So that has, I suppose, always been there. But there is that anxiety of many immigrants coming to the United States that what are we going to cede by having intermarriage? Now, of course, given the numbers of the Muslim community writ large, the idea of choice certainly exists. Can't find anyone here, quote unquote, go back home. So the notion then of the vanishing American Muslim, to paraphrase from Alan Dershowitz's book of the same title with the last word changed, doesn't really seem to exist. Intermarriage in and of itself is not necessarily going to create a reduction of Muslimness from a theological standpoint. If there's going to be some kind of cultural variable change, that's a different story, and many Muslims then have to take a much more honest assessment of themselves, how much culture they've already negotiated and absorbed. So I've got a couple on that same thing. I'm just going to read both of these together because they address both of us. One is, how does conversion into Judaism or Islam affect assimilation? And the other is, are Muslims allowed to assimilate? Do they want to? Do Jews want to? So when it comes to conversion into Islam, this is, again, a very important factor when you see particularly Anglo, Black, and Hispanic conversion to Islam. It's important to recognize that they already have an indigenized cultural paradigm that is linked to the United States. So for them, it's by and large simply a theological conversion. Now, some of them feel, and some of them are perhaps nudged and coerced into thinking, that if you want to be a full Muslim, you got to take on a new name, you have to go ahead and dress differently, you have to take on certain cultural appropriation, but again, there is no theological mandate for that to happen. And usually when those are pushed into that, they have what Darius Shayegan would call cultural schizophrenia, because they have become dislodged from a cultural paradigm that was organic and that was very natural to them. As far as being allowed to assimilate, this is a great question because, again, it really then hinges on what do we mean by assimilation. And often some of the biggest roadblocks come from those who are cultural preservationists more than religious preservationists, because as far as the religion of Islam goes, it has always assumed the dimensions of the culture in which it occupies. Islam is not a solid and it's not a gas, it's actually a liquid where it can assume the morphology of the container or the vessel in which it is. If more Muslims read more Islamic history, they would realize the more harmonious relationship of culture in new lands and how Islam was always able to find a home there.
And I would add that in terms of Jewish assimilation, one of the things that has facilitated it is that Jews, let's say, to follow what Saeed was talking about, the whiteness of Jews. Whiteness for Jews is what, in some ways, it's situational, it's relative. So in some neighborhoods, Jews are white. In some neighborhoods, Jews are not. And so it's varied in that way. I mean, there were Jews who came from Eastern Europe who, like Saeed pointed out in a different context, they were actually mistaken as being black. There were Jews who came from Eastern Europe who lived in the American South whose shops were attacked because the white Southerners thought they were black. Yeah, but the other thing about Jewish whiteness is it's always been easy for Jews to pass as white. Whether or not they were considered white or not. If you weren't, you know the phrase, too Jewish, you could blend in. It was easy to do it that way. Did Jews want to do that? Well, it's like Saeed said, it's a complicated question. It's not so much wanting not to be Jewish, as much as it is wanting to experience things beyond the Jewish community. And really, the more we study this phenomenon, the more we see that the larger tendency is to figure out a way to become part of mainstream society, but still maintain some connection. It's also, no question, a generational phenomenon. There was the generation that arrived here. The first generation that grew up here was determined to be as assimilated as possible. The next generation revolted against that. It's not something linear. It's almost cyclical in that way. Do we have time for one more?
Yeah.
Well, I have a short one and a long one. The short question is, what book or article by Forrest Allen do you recommend to contrast his vision with the melting pot? And while I was listening, I actually I pulled up Amazon on my phone. And the book is, just get the exact title. His land-breaking book was called Cultural Pluralism and the American Idea. The other one is called Culture and Democracy in the United States. He's definitely worth reading. Now, the other question is, and this really encapsulates a lot of what we were talking about tonight, is it seems that Jews are ready to give up some of their religion, but keep their tradition, while Muslims seem to do it in the reverse, i.e. they cling more to their religion than, I guess, to their tradition. And it's a very interesting question, I guess, semantically, but really it's, when we say religion and tradition, when we say religion and tradition, these are first very, very amorphous concepts, and the line between them is amorphous. How do you distinguish between preserving a tradition and preserving a religious practice or custom? There's simply too much overlap. Now, I think what the question is getting at is that American Jews tend to be more ethnically Jewish and more rarely religiously Jewish. But again, these are amorphous concepts. Once upon a time, eating, let's say, gefilte fish at a certain time, at a certain holiday, wasn't only something ethnic, it was also something religious. So the boundary between the two of them is kind of amorphous. I'm not sure about the generalization that Jews tend to cling more to traditions and less to religion. It's a mishmash. There's some of both, I think, in both cases.
Well, actually, most Muslims cling to their guns and Bibles. Okay, wrong crowd. Again, I think probably if you were to ask this question 40 years ago, you would get a completely different response. You would say that most Muslims intuitively, if they were going to cling to something, was going to be to the culture of their ethnic or national origin. Religion was subsumed, and that had a lot to do with the zeitgeist. It had to do with the fact that, by and large, America was certainly, and some of you may look at this nostalgically, a much more secular country than it is today. Today, it seems as though many Muslims, and again, this is a great chicken and the egg analogy, were they the ones who were religious in their tone and in their perception, and the rest of society caught up with them? Or are they simply going along with something that has shifted in society? Now, given their numbers and given their relative diminished social and political capital in this country, I would say it's probably the latter. The fact that the terminology, the cultural literacy is much more within a religious context. We take, for example, any award show, whether it is the Grammys, the Emmys, or the Oscars. There used to be a time when you never heard the person winning the award thank God. They would thank the manager, they would thank the agent, they would thank the academy. Now it seems de rigueur that this has to come out, and it's usually one of these, or what are the verbal cues, because it seems as though that is what is expected, or that is what is anticipated by society. So again, I would say that it really then comes down to when we are, more than from where we are. I'm just going to go ahead and finish this one last question, because I just want to be respectful about this. How do you explain someone like Louis Farrakhan and his virulent, I'm sorry, the word, something expose of anti-Semitism and how American Muslims may relate? Well, by and large, American Muslims do not relate to Louis Farrakhan or to the Nation of Islam. And in fact, this has been a major rupture still when it comes to Black American Muslims and immigrant Muslims. There was no frame of reference to understand the Nation of Islam because it really wasn't so much a theology as it was a political liberation theology born of a very specific historical political context, i.e. the Black American experience in America. For somebody migrating, and especially when they were migrating in the 1960s and the 1970s, they really didn't understand it. They understood Muhammad Ali. They learned later on about Malcolm X, both of whom, in fact, then made the transition from the Nation of Islam to mainstream Sunni Islam, as did 10 years after the founder of NOI, Elijah Muhammad, his son takes the congregation, 90% of it, into mainstream Islam. When it comes to Louis Farrakhan, and when it comes to the tenets of the Nation of Islam, the vast majority of Muslims just simply see it as being another sect that happens to have the name Islam in it, probably akin to the whole notion of, are Jews for Jesus really Jewish?
Good example.
Thank you very much.
Good evening. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the congregation of Beth, the leadership, and the Rabbi. And I'd like to thank our distinguished speakers, Professor Howard and Professor Saeed. I'd like also to thank our partners in this program, the AGC and JCRC. And I couldn't find a better friend and a partner than Alicia, David, Brian, and Corey, and everybody who put an effort in this. And especially the Rabbits Foundation, who had the vision to fund this program a few years ago and put our community to work together. We heard the word melting pot so many times, at least 30 times. Melting remind me of heat, of heat, you know? And maybe that's the idea, that some people who promote hate are putting heat under our communities, both Muslim and Jews. We want to assimilate, but we want to be a beautiful salad bowl. We do not want to melt under heat. On that note, I thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I'll just take a brief moment. I know it's getting late. I want to welcome my friend, Dr. Mahmoud Hadidi of the Michigan Muslim Community Council. I get to do the same thing that Professor Lupovitch does, to say welcome home. This is our shul, this is our synagogue. To our friends who may be here for the first time, consider the doors open to you always. This is our home, this is your home. Much as we felt at home, and for the worst possible reasons, to have to be together, but at the vigil just 2 nights ago, where we sat side by side at an experience that still leaves me emotionally exhausted, to sit through that kind of observance, and sadly it's too familiar. And so when I ran into a lot of people that night who said, this is so nice to be together, and it's for the worst reason. And I kind of wanted to look back and say, well then join us. You know, I want to be careful not to do too much promoting on a night like that, but this is what we do. This is what we as organizations do. And I will thank Saeed for saying, and it's rare, I'm not sure I've ever seen you actually like do a little pat on the back, but it's well deserved, because you, the two of you, have set the example You've led by example. You've brought us in. You've challenged us to think differently. We don't always agree, and that's great. And we, as organizations, have created the climate for that, with the foundation that had the vision to also allow us to do this and more when we've asked and when we've needed it. And so it's really the perfect fit. I mean, it really is that. And to those in attendance, I encourage you to do your part, right? You know, for many, there are many familiar faces. You come to these programs, bring someone with you, right? Tell someone about it. We have one more next Tuesday, Wayne State University. And it's the third piece of the story about the politics and political involvement. It's sure to be fascinating, certainly timely and relevant. So encourage people to attend. And finally, in terms of what you can do, consider the fact that if these organizations don't exist, then a foundation wouldn't be able to find us, right? So we have to have the support to be here in the first place, to continue to be here, to pursue our mission, to bring our communities closer and closer together. We're determined to do it, and I am most grateful for the team that makes it possible, including, of course, Corey Young, who most of you know and has been doing this work for some time. So I want to thank Corey. I want to thank the rest of the team. And lastly, I want to encourage you to stick around because we have dessert for you. We want you to spend some time reflecting a little bit on the experience. I want to thank you and hope to see you again next week. Thanks so much.
Parking for next Tuesday? Parking advice for next Tuesday?
Parking advice. We'll talk.
Want to advertise your documentary on my stream?
Yeah, you're very good.
Oh.
It would be awesome.
Yeah.
Do you want us to do like a little presentation?
Yeah, I'm still recording. Yeah. Whatever. Yeah, sure. This is Duvid here. Program's just finishing up. There's going to be reception. These two women from Moscow are making a documentary, and I'd like them to share what they're saying. So, please.
We're going to talk about a project that we involved in. It's called the Universal Brain Project, and it's initiated by the Allures International Public Institute. And we are outside of the politics and religion, but what we do is we aim to bring and unite people together around the world based on the moral and spiritual values. And we are looking to build a new society where each of us understand each other and can help each other in any situation such as climate change, even if there is a catastrophic event. How do we come together? Because there's so much separation in the world, and we want to make sure that people are united in inner qualities, in the knowledge, and in their spiritual and moral values. And we made such a great movie which called Universal Brain. This movie were made by participants of the Allures International Public Institute. What is the volunteering?
I'll share that document. I'll share the link in the description of this video.
Yeah, the Universal Brain movie is like was people from all over 140 countries were participating in this movie. So this is like great. And it's called The Choice, and the first part. The first part, there's going to be another part coming up, and it's going to break it down into more topics. But the idea is that we were able to interview so many people and so many different cultures, religious backgrounds, scientists, economical backgrounds, scientists, researchers, spiritual leaders.
You might be including the professors from this event.
Yes, we will be including professors from today's seminar, and we ask questions that are very important to the society today, and find those universal brains that connect people on levels where you can still keep your religion and you can keep your culture, but what it is that connects us all on the inside.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah, God bless. Okay, it's a great event. I'm going to try to live stream next week's also. We got Temple Beth Am. It's actually my first time here.